Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video, and today I want to talk about affixes in Mythic Plus dungeons. This is a topic that comes up basically every season of the game, but I wanted to kind of give my take on how I think it could be transformed into kind of like affixes 2.0. I think the kind of structure is decent, but I think it just needs to be revitalized. We've had more or less a similar structure since Legion. They did introduce like seasonal affixes that they've since taken out. They've obviously done a lot of like rotating of affixes and pulling some out, reworking some of them. But I think honestly, a lot of them still feel pretty stale and just overly punishing. So I just want to kind of talk about what we have today in the current pool of affixes and some thoughts going forward into the next expansion or next season. Okay, let's start off with why I think this is needed. So first of all, I think the affix structure is there to kind of help dungeons feel different every week, which I think is good. If you're just running the same dungeons over and over again for the entire season, that can get pretty stale by itself. So I think the affixes, like in general, change up what you're doing week to week in a way that could be fun. I think the struggle is right now you're kind of just picking which weeks of affixes feel like the least impactful to help you push higher and to get your score higher. If at the end of the day you're trying to push your score as much as possible, that's a goal for a lot of people, but some people also just want to have fun, either while they're doing that or in general. And I think the current set of affixes is just too punishing and not fun enough. So a lot when I say fun, just because it's some challenge to overcome doesn't mean it can't be fun. If you kind of can counter an affix, I think that can be enjoyable. But for the most part, these affixes don't have a whole lot of counters that feel super satisfying, although there are some of them. And I do think there also have some issues with like various utility balance within the game as well, which make them harder to counter effectively if you're trying to get like a wider range of group comps. So in my opinion, I think what we really want to go towards is kind of an affixes 2.0 revamp where it's okay for affixes to be a little bit more wacky and to have a bit more of that. I think people throw around like the kiss curse idea a lot, which is basically for a negative affix only, you would also add a positive component or a positive spin on that affix that gives you some kind of benefit to countering it, that I think would make dungeons feel a little bit more exciting week to week of like what strats you can do to help boost your damage or boost the efficiency in that key based on the affixes, instead of today, which is basically, hey, how much are these affixes going to slow me down? So I'm going to kind of go over in a little bit of depth in each kind of affix in a few categories and kind of talk about some ideas and some problems that they have today and maybe what we can do in the future. So let's start off with Fortified and Tyrannical. So I don't want to beat on this too much because I think a lot of other people have given thoughts and feedback on this. I think Fortified and Tyrannical have just kind of not developed well enough. I think the idea in practice is there of saying like, okay, on this week the trash is more deadly. On this week the bosses are more deadly. That as an idea on paper I think is okay, but I think what we've seen in practice that the scaling just hasn't made that feel great. And what I mean by that is as you push high enough, it's all bad. Like in a high enough tyrannical key, the trash can still be difficult, and certainly in a high enough fortified key, the bosses are still challenging. Even on fortified weeks, it's not uncommon to still brick a dungeon because a boss was hitting you too hard. You're kind of just moving like how many one shots are a part of the bosses or trash on week to week. And while some people can adjust builds on fortified versus tyrannical, it doesn't seem very common. On just like a cursory glance of Icy Veins or Wowhead guides, very few of them actually recommend build changes on tyrannical weeks versus fortified weeks. Now, that could be a fault in the talent system, or it could just be kind of showing that like the dungeon itself actually isn't changing too much with these affixes, and these are just kind of weird scaling effects that I feel like just aren't impactful at kind of the level that they're looking for. I don't think they need to be scrapped entirely, but I do think the scaling of how these work should be changed to basically say like, yeah, on fortified weeks, the trash is going to be the most difficult, which also means the bosses should be comparably, not as bad. Same thing on tyrannical weeks. You should be able to do bigger fortified pulls or bigger trash pulls maybe on tyrannical weeks because the trash isn't as bad. But you also got to be careful. And one thing we've definitely seen a lot of this season, as you scale up tyrannical, currently one of the problems with that is if you're just adding health to bosses, that's just, making a boss that was like 2-3 minutes, now it's 4 or 5, 6 minutes. That's super boring. A lot of these bosses are not meant to be killed or last that long. So I think the scaling of that just gets kind of out of control where it's like, yeah, why am I fighting a boss for 6 minutes? Or even on fortified weeks, why am I fighting a boss for 4 or 5 minutes on fortified weeks? Which is happening if you're getting up to higher levels of keys. So obviously this can vary season to season, but I do think the scaling of these definitely needs to be looked at to either prevent more of that from happening or making it feel a bit more like you have some choice involved with your builds with these guys and making them have a bit better identity, especially when combined with other affixes in the group. So that's kind of the kind of opening to the video. Let's move on to the 7+ affixes bracket and see what those can do. Okay, as I mentioned before, I don't think a lot of these affixes actually need to be scrapped. So, and you'll kind of see what I mean. So let's start off with Entangling. This was a newer one that was added this expansion. I think it's actually worked out decently well. I say as a priest main that I can easily get rid of Entangling. But I think in the spirit of kind of making things feel fresh, and you're going to see this kind of theme throughout this video, my suggestion here is to actually add something to these affixes that also work on the opposite end of the spectrum. So with Entangling right now, if you clear your route, you've completed the challenge, you're good to go. Now, what I would love to see added is the kind of kiss side of that affix, or the positive side, which is, so if you actually break your Entangling over a mob, you take that AoE kind of circle around you that the Entangling encompasses that you normally have to run out of. If you actually break it over a mob, what if the mob also got that root effect for a short period of time, a couple seconds maybe? I think it'd be probably overpowered if it was a stun, but I do think it'd be interesting if you kind of flip that mechanic to actually be like, yeah, if you can play around this, you can actually root or stun enemies that, you know, maybe isn't broken by damage, for example, if it's a root. I think that kind of an example would make things super interesting, where you're not only overcoming the challenge of the affix, but it's also helping you in that dungeon. So in this case, you know, you're applying a CC to the mobs if you're in that radius. There is some gameplay there too about like standing in a spot where that's most useful, and maybe that's a bit more dangerous to do as well, but you get a better payoff if you can pull it off. So I think it'd be a fun addition to Entangling. And you'll see similar things with these other examples. So moving on, the next bit is Incorporeal. So again, another new one. I think this one also can be frustrating, especially with the kind of randomness of having 1 or 2 spawn. I think if they kind of toned this down and it was just 1 max that would spawn, and also make it work with AoE CC abilities, I think this would go a long way, and just basically say like, okay, CC at once, whether it's a single target stun, an AoE CC, or the long crowd control like Polymorph or Shackle and Dead that also work today. I think if you just democratize that and make it work with all kinds of abilities, you kind of eliminate some of the weird class utility problems that some specs have. They've tried to address this in the past, but I don't think it's fully worked out well, especially when you can't even CC it for the full duration. So I think reworking like that would be kind of table stakes going forward. But then I think a really interesting addition that not a whole lot of people play around with today, kind of depends on your comp, but if you didn't know, classes like Death Knight and Priest can actually mind control Incorporeal. And what that does is the Incorporeal still does its cast that it does if you fail to interrupt it, but instead it actually goes on the enemies instead. And I believe it casts twice. Each one is a 5% damage reduction, or damage debuff basically, to those mobs. So if you are on a boss and it's tyrannical and you get that mind control is now making the boss deal 10% less damage. That's massive. And I think that would actually be a good direction to move this affix into, to kind of make that of a more common thing and kind of give up what Priests and Death Knights have somewhat unique today and be like, yeah, that's just how the affix works now normally. We're only ever going to spawn 1 at once. It's easy to CC, but as soon as you do it, you immediately get that cast to go off on enemies that gives you the full 10% at 1 stack, and then it goes away. I think it's kind of like a random addition to the dungeon, but it's rewarding you if you do your CC correctly, rather than just right now where it's basically just punishing you if you don't do it correctly. And kind of a similar thing, I think we could do something with Afflicted as well. I think people have also mentioned maybe you just combine the two and to say like, okay, Incorp and Afflicted are now the same thing. You either CC it or dispel it, and then you get that effect or it goes away. That's certainly an option as well. You could also kind of take the same idea with Incorporeal and apply it to Afflicted and say, okay, with Afflicted, every time that you dispel or heal it to full, you now proc it as basically like a heal. It could even be like a ground heal effect on the mob that just gives your group periodic healing for like 10 seconds or whatever after you complete that check. Just something to give you kind of some satisfaction of like, okay, we countered this. maybe I had to heal into it or use a dispel against it. But the reward that I get from that is I get some kind of extra group healing with that. Maybe it lets me, as a healer, focus on my DPS more for that period of time, or something like that to make it feel more rewarding. So that's the Afflicted guy. And then the ideas for Volcanic and Storming are kind of similar. So I'm not a big fan of the fact that Volcanic and Storming kind of have similar, like outplay problems today. They're very similar. I think one is kind of more ranged heavy. The other one is more melee heavy. I think, honestly, my suggestion for this, if you didn't want to combine them straight up, would be to also make these apply to enemies. Maybe at a reduced rate, but I do think it'd be pretty interesting if now Volcanic or Storming can also AoE CC those mobs in a knockup. I think it'd be a lot of fun on trash weeks where you'd actually be like excited to play more Storming because it is helping CC the pack down and make it die faster theoretically because you're having to interrupt less or handle the CCs more. It could get pretty chaotic, especially with Storming, but I think it'd be fun to try out, at least for a season. Maybe this is chaotic, but I don't know. I think it'd be fun. So that's all the 7+ affixes. Let's talk about the 14+ affixes next. All right, so these affixes are arguably a bit more challenging to deal with. So I think they're these are harder to fix or harder to augment, I think, in some way. But I think it'd be fun to talk about. So starting off with everyone's favorite, Bolstering. So we recently had this going on, or if you're playing keys this week when the video is released, you're experiencing this right now. This one is hard. I think this is probably the one that is interacted with the most these days, which can be a good thing in some ways if you like routing dungeons differently. I think this is harder when dungeons don't have as many routing decisions. So I think in this season in particular, there's a lot of like, you kind of just have to play the route that the dungeon makes you play. And I think that makes this harder. For example, in Blackrook Hold, you can't really skip the mini bosses these days without something like Shroud or Invispot. So if you're just playing normally, you have to play that mob, and that mob is difficult to play on Bolstering. There's also dungeons like Everbloom that just work terribly with this affix, and a bunch of smaller mobs are triggering on death affixes. That just needs to get fixed. I don't really have a way around that. That shouldn't happen. But I think, this is difficult if dungeons aren't made to be routed differently, because I think that is something unique to Bolstering compared to some other affixes, is you might choose to pull things differently on Bolstering week, which could be interesting. But right now it just hasn't worked out that way, so I do think it needs something else added. The joke here, if you weren't just going to scrap it, was every time one of my party members dies, we also get the Bolstering buff as well. To basically like, okay, if an enemy kills one of my party members, we all now deal 20% more damage stacking. So any of those cases where you're like chain wiping on something, maybe you get something out of it. But that's more of a joke than anything. I think saving this is really challenging without adjusting the dungeons themselves and giving us good routing options. I think this one is just tough. You'd have to do a lot of significant stuff to make this feel better. So we'll see what they can think of, though. Next up is Spiteful. So Spiteful, I think, is not bad, although it can be kind of like the Pad Lord affix. But I do think the one kind of challenge with it today is it can really slow you down depending on what you're doing. It can also be kind of hard to counter in like tight spaces. So the idea I had with this was for every Spiteful that you kill, the group gains a stacking movement speed buff temporarily. To help kind of, mask, okay, I'm having to stay a bit longer to finish the pack off to kill these Spiteful, and maybe I can't kite as well into the next pack. So the counter there is you just get a movement speed buff, and it helps you move around the dungeon a little bit better. Maybe encourages you to finish killing off the Spiteful faster, especially in the case of like your healer really needs to drink or something else like that. I think that'd be a fun change to this affix, and it's a small change, but I think it'd be a lot of fun to play with. Moving on to Raging. So Raging is a hard one because I think they have changed this quite a lot recently. It's not quite as bad as it has been in the past, although it still can be quite punishing. I think the big change here is just apply it to allies as well. To be like, okay, if you are an ally and you fall below this health threshold, maybe instead of a CC reduction, you get a damage reduction buff applied, or even the throughput buff applied, which would be fun. And maybe not something you would like want to play around and be like, okay, healer, don't heal me. I need to get more throughput. Maybe that's a little bit degen, but I think it'd be kind of fun to kind of put the affix as a global on the whole dungeon, enemies and friendlies. It'd be kind of interesting. So I think there's other things they could do with it too, but I think that kind of counter would make it more thematic. So, and then Bursting. So Bursting is a difficult one. I actually don't have any raw suggestions for this because I think it's kind of an odd affix today in that unlike most of the other ones, this one actually can get kind of feel easier the higher you go up in a key. Now, the reason for that is partially due to obviously like group coordination. You can kind of align all of your stacks to happen at the same time, and then if you have a master spell in your group, you can easily get rid of that. But also, as you go lower in the key environment, you're just pulling more mobs faster. You probably have a higher chance of getting 2 or 3 chests, which means you're just going through packs quicker. It's part of the reason why specs like Shadow don't feel as great in lower packs, because they're just dying so quickly. So I think bursting is kind of difficult because it kind of gets harder the lower the key is in some regards, because the actual health damage that's ticking, still ticks regardless of what it is. So yeah, I think if they could change this up to have a bit more scaling on how much that ticks for based on the key level, that would feel better, and kind of adjust the scaling. That would be like the kind of main suggestion here. Otherwise, I think it's going to be difficult because, yeah, if you don't have a priest in your group, it's going to be tough regardless. Even though they did change Master Spell to be a 2-minute cooldown, and a high enough key, you're only doing those big pulls every couple minutes anyway, so you can actually still play around it quite well. You're just pretty punished if you don't have that, or you're in a lower key environment. So something to address that would be interesting. And last but not least is Sanguine. So again, another affix that's been changed quite a lot, and can be quite punishing for the group, just because, if your tank isn't kiting correctly, that could cause a lot of problems. So I do think, they can continue to adjust how much healing something could be done, maybe even cap how much healing a certain mob can do. If you cap it at, say, like 10% of the mob's health, you're kind of reducing that burden on the tank. I think, as well as, like, again, the Kiss Curse idea coming into be, it's like, okay, when you spawn a Sanguine pool, instead of it damaging you as a player when you stand in it, what if it actually heals you instead? Or puts like a healing absorb, I don't know, something on you to kind of make it a bit more of a gameplay mechanic, where it's like, okay, instead of just spawning more stuff on the floor to dodge, which can be hard in some environments, what if it gave you some kind of benefit if you spawn it and then stood in it? But also, I think the trick part here is, right now this affix is almost 100% on your tank or any like knockback CCs that you have, which I think is just putting too much burden on the tank role specifically, and I think they have enough to do already, and I'm not a big fan of that. So, but yeah, so that's my kind of suggestion for these kind of rounds of affixes. Let me know what you kind of think. This was just kind of off the top ideas, and mostly this comes from being a Mythic Plus player since Legion. I've played basically every season to a reasonably high level, and I think it's just getting a little stale. They have kind of changed up affixes. We've lost affixes like Teaming and Skittish. We've lost the seasonal affixes. Some were really fun, some not so much. But I think this would be the next like evolution of Mythic Plus for me, to make it feel a bit more reinvigorating and kind of more exciting week to week, in that it's not only me countering affixes, but I'm also getting something out of countering it that isn't just, okay, it's gone now. So those are my ideas. I'm excited to see what Blizzard does. I think some of these ideas would be really fun in like a season 4, like off-season type of thing. Or maybe just as a whole new expansion feature to begin with. So, well, again, let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching this video, and we will see you in the next one.